Released in 2008 on the PlayStation 3, Valkyria Chronicles came to surprise the world of gaming with its tactical revolution. Later ported to PC, PS4 and Switch, it's considered as not only one of the best strategy RPGs of all time, but also as one of the best video games of all time. So today we're gonna go through 10 things that you probably didn't know about this JRPG masterpiece. Number 10. Inspired by real-life events. It's a well-known fact that the game is based on World War II, which took place mostly in Europe. Not so cleverly though, the developers created a fictional continent for it called Europa. The war breaks out because of an incredibly important resource known as Ragnite ore, which is pretty much the equivalent of oil or petroleum in real life. This is basically a second inspiration for the main plot of the game. What's interesting about it though is that the game's main country, known as Gallia, didn't quite take the inspiration from the major ones that fought in the war, rather than from smaller countries like Belgium and Netherlands, which were seriously caught up in the war without barely having anything to do with it. The developers also considered basing Gallia on Switzerland, yet another small country always in the middle of big power country wars. Except there was a bit of an issue. Switzerland is known for its large mountains intersecting with battle terrains quite often. That would make it impossible for tanks to maneuver freely. And since tanks are a huge part of Valkyria Chronicles, even since its inception ideas, it wouldn't make any sense to base Gallia on Switzerland. Number 9. It was going to be a Sakura Wars game. Now that I mentioned the inception ideas, let's talk a bit about the origins of the game. It dates all the way back to 2003. It was conceived by director Shuntaro Tanaka, who had directed other RPGs such as Skies of Arcadia. Also conceived by producer Ryotaro Nonaka, who was working on the Shinobi spin-off Nightshade for the PS2 back then. These two guys though had one little game series in common, Sakura Wars. They had both worked on it. A series of grid-based strategy RPGs mixing a visual novel style of narrative. Back then, every single game had been exclusive to Japan. We wouldn't see a single release until So Long My Love on the Wii and PS2 in 2010. So, going back to Valkyria Chronicles, it was in 2003 when these two guys decided to work together. Their goal was to create some kind of strategy RPG with a serious narrative and adult characters based on a war. This, however, wouldn't exactly work for a Sakura Wars title, and they knew Sega would put a lot of restrictions, like having to base their characters on the ones from the series, or having to tone down the adult protagonism and narrative. So after brainstorming more and more, the duo decided to go into a different direction, thankfully. I say thankfully not because I don't like Sakura Wars, I'm a big fan actually, but just imagine Valkyria Chronicles as a romantic harem visual novel story based in the 1920s. Yeah, I'm glad they took the project somewhere else. Number 8. It was going to be a PS2 game. 2003 was when most of this happened. Tanaka and Nonaka wanted their strategy RPG, so they knew they had to bring on board experienced developers, but obviously they also needed a console for their release. The PlayStation 2 was their choice, and part of the game was planned for its hardware and controls. The initial ideas were about a regular grid-based strategy RPG with an overhead view, much different from the real-time view and combat we saw in the final release. Welkin and Alicia, formerly known as Alma, were the main characters since the game's inception, as you can see in this artwork, but the rest of the cast was nowhere near as large as the one we know. Due to the PS2 hardware's limitations, the project became smaller, with restrictions that wouldn't make the ideal game come true, so the team also considered the PSP back in 2005, though they faced the same limitations and frustrating walls. Ironically, considering the sequel will be later released on the PSP. But on this portable system, Tanaka's vision wouldn't be fulfilled this way. However, the PS3 was announced, its hardware, its capabilities, its graphical improvements, yup, it seemed like the best way to go. But if the PS3 was going to be the perfect home for a project like Valkyria Chronicles, then the game had to be massive. So, possibilities shot up through the roof, and brainstorming took the game into an even different direction. Number 7. Galleon Panzers. Galleon Panzers was the initial name of the game. Tanaka will write the main story with a secondary team of writers to assist him. Co-director Takaharu Terada joined in, as the project was now something much bigger than originally planned. Takeshi Osawa was brought on board as the main designer. Canvas was the name of the graphic engine, especially to allow the beautiful cel-shaded graphics the game ended up with. Music was handled by Hitoshi Sakimoto, known for Final Fantasy Tactics. So, with a team this important, the guys wondered what kind of universe they wanted to create and what kind of name they will give to their game. Based on a World War II, but also adding fantasy elements. Yeah, they also wanted to focus majorly on Kato development, by the way. So their little strategy game under the name Galleon Panzers wouldn't mean much to anyone and will sound like your average war-based video game. So Galleon Chronicles was considered now, but it wasn't appealing whatsoever. In the end, they took the term Valkyria to create more mystery, intrigue, and symbolize the fantasy elements. Final name in Japan was Battlefield Valkyria Galleon Chronicles. Yeah. So, Sega of America merely shortened that as Valkyria Chronicles, which in my opinion is a much better name. Number 6. Battlefield what? So, why Valkyria? What was the inspiration of that? As I mentioned, the game's story is mostly based on smaller European countries that were caught up in the middle of the war. The Nordic nations were also one such example, and Tanaka was fascinated at the time with the lore. In fact, a lot of names of characters and places are based on actual names and places within these countries. But the Norse mythology wasn't really a big part of it seems. I say it seems because, well, Tanaka has never explained or clarified if he took inspiration from the Valkyries, who were Odin's scouts he will send to recruit fallen warriors in Midgard to fight in the Ragnarok War in Asgard. The Valkyrias are powerful characters in the game, and since soldiers fight under their command, I'm guessing that's where the influence comes from, especially because of the character Selvaria, who's one of the main antagonists in the game. Lastly, my assumption as why Valkyria and not Valkyrie is because they didn't want players to confuse the game to the well-established Valkyrie profile series. Again, that's just speculation on my part. Number 5. XCOM Chronicles. Several years ago, the game started getting a lot of comparisons to the XCOM series. Well, most of them were strategy RPGs created since 1994, true, but they played nothing like Valkyria Chronicles. In fact, the one game that started resembling it is XCOM Enemy Within, released in 2011. And guess what? Its developers have admitted that Valkyria was a big influence on its design. So, as you can see, it was the other way around all this time. Valkyria Chronicles influenced XCOM and not the opposite, which is what a lot of people believe. Number 4. The evolution of the Dark Sense. One of the main inspirations for the story was the constant ethnic wars that have plagued the world since forever. In the game, there's a race called the Dark Sense, who are treated with discrimination and rejection even by some Galleons. Well, it was mostly Middle East countries who this race was based on. However, and very strangely, the Dark Sense were something completely different at the beginning. They were actually going to be Nekos, people with cat ears. Not only that, according to what's shown in the game's art book, which shows some early designs, some soldiers would attack while mounted on freaking lizards! Wow! Imagine Valkyria Chronicles with cat people and lizards fighting each other. The original Darksen race was called the Bast Folk, merely on the design whims of artist Raita Honjo, a fan of cat people. What you're seeing right now is actually the initial design of Isara. Yeah, This was because they were serious about adding fantasy elements to the game, but in the end, Tanaka said, "Nope! I want a serious, mature story with only the powerful Valkyrias as the sole fantasy element on it." Thank goodness. Number 3. Permadeath Justified. Just like the Fire Emblem series, this game has permadeath, only for the secondary characters of course, but unlike in Fire Emblem, you can call in a medic to save your defeated characters and take them to the nursery. If you don't do that within a couple of turns, then yes, they're gone forever. This was done on purpose because, as I mentioned, the developers wanted the story to focus heavily on character development, and instead of having generic units or soldiers like in Advance Wars, the purpose was to make the players connect with every character, including the ones with smaller roles. Some of these characters got side quest episodes of their own, as you may already know. Producer Ryutaro Nonaka said in an interview, "We really wanted to get that sense of urgency and also the realism of when someone in your team is hurt and lying just there. Do you want to go and help them, or do you want to go on with your mission? Do you want to help them and risk your own life, or do you just want to leave them there and go on?" Wow! I really want to cover this topic since I know a lot of you hate permadeath features with a passion. I thought this would offer a different perspective on the matter. There's an interview that delves deeper into this subject. A link to it will be available in the description of this video. Number 2. From massive failure to critical acclaim. You'd be surprised to know that this game was a commercial failure when it came out. A lot of PS3 games, especially genres like JRPGs, were hurt because of the console's initial release. You probably don't remember, but the PS3 was initially a flop for costing way too much, also being hard to develop games for. So during its first years, most games got the same treatment. Valkyria Chronicles, despite its quite positive critical reception, was basically a hidden gem! Hard to believe, I know, but a few things happened, one after the other, things that sent the game into a 180 degrees turnabout. First, there was an anime in 2009. Sure, it stayed in Japan and it offered a slightly alternative version to the story with some new characters. Regardless, it made a lot of noise over there and people started buying the game thanks to it. That very same year, the game was re-released under the label known as The Best, similar to a Greatest Hits but in Japan. The PS3's hardware eventually got better, its reputation was saved, Sony reduced its price by $100, and by word of mouth, Valkyria Chronicles slowly became a massive success. Availability matters, people, and so does price, and since websites like YouTube began seeing the rise of gaming channels, reviewers everywhere praised and heavily recommended this legendary masterpiece. Number 1. Guinness World Record. On June 18 of 2010, Valkyria Chronicles was widely considered as a critically acclaimed video game. In just 2 years, it went from being a hidden gem to a worldwide known game. Guinness World Records took notice of this and awarded Sega for 2 particular games. Virtua Fighter, apparently for being the first fighting game to use 3D polygon graphics, and of course, Valkyria Chronicles, merely as the most critically acclaimed strategy RPG for the PS3. And it sure is, and I think it totally deserves it. It's rare for a JRPG to be included in Guinness, and for an excellent video game as this, I couldn't be happier. This is a game that came to revolutionize the strategy games industry, offering unique ideas, mixing various key elements from previous games, and delivering nothing but originality, up to the point that it became a huge influence out there. Plus, in an era where most JRPGs were about 17-year-old childhood friends saving the world and fighting God, the story of this game came as a big breath of fresh air. As you may already know, several sequels were spawned, the anime and some shorts were released, ports and remasters were published. To date, Valkyria Chronicles alone and all of its versions have sold over 2 million copies around the world. And that was my look into 10 things you didn't know about Valkyria Chronicles. The best, without a doubt whatsoever, the best strategy RPG on the PlayStation 3. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!